As you know, the Supreme Court is not just the final court of our land, but a public policy court. This pronouncement by the voice-led Supreme Court, even if made or bitter, is a policy directive to all Nigerian lawyers in the bar and on the bench to champion the interpretation, evolution, and amendment of our laws to enable our society to make social and economic progress. As legal practitioners, you must have surely recognized this. The theme of this keynote therefore calls for much thoughtful consideration, not only as professionals within a legal tradition, but as citizens of a nation in transition, even as it is challenged literally from all corners. I'll now talk about our nation being at another crossroads. My lords, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, every nation faces several crossroads, but there is always one amongst them, the Nobel laureates Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, the authors of Why Nations Fail, referred to as a critical juncture due to its historical, social, and economic significance. It is my humble opinion that the last critical juncture our nation experienced, and in my view squandered, was in 2007, when Nigeria was largely free of any foreign debt, had more than $40 billion as net, not gross foreign reserves, and nearly $30 billion in the excess crude account. Our nation was ready to take off, to attain its manifest destiny of being the leading African nation and the pride of the black race. Tragically, President Obasanjo's handpicked successors were unable to manage what was bequeathed to them, and it has mostly been downhill since then. We are now indebted. Our excess crude account is down to a few $100,000. Our foreign reserves down to net of about $20 billion. It's tough. We are not in a good place. I believe that Nigeria is once again at another critical inflection point in its history, as we struggle, beset by economic turbulence, social upheaval, and institutionalized distrust, particularly between the government and the governed. The challenge before us is to consider the enduring role of the legal profession in building a society governed by law, reason, and reform-minded leadership, amidst economic recalibration on a path marked by subsidy removals, exchange rate unification, and fiscal adjustments. Nigerians are being asked once again to endure hardship in the promise of long-term gain. But as any seasoned reformer knows, the impetus for economic reform and transformation is rooted in politics. And as we all know, politics without trust can be perceived as mere chicanery. Therefore, for reform to succeed, there must be trust between the reformer and the people. In parallel, our judiciary, meant to be the bedrock of fairness and order, is under intense scrutiny. Concerns about delayed justice, procedural inefficiencies, and in some cases, judicial compromise, to put the matter delicately, erode public confidence. The rise in forum shopping, the weaponization of ex parte orders in political matters, and the growing perception that justice is for sale and available only to the rich and powerful would cause the perceptive observer to conclude that what Nigerian courts do is the administration of law and not the administration of justice. In Nigeria, there is a seemingly unbridgeable gulf between law and justice. Not only is justice wanting, but the law that is administered seems to be according to the wishes of the executive. The demand on you as practitioners in the temple of justice is a sober introspection as you contemplate whether indeed Justitia is blind and whether she holds the scales of justice in fine balance. In Okocha against the state, 1995 Nigerian Weekly Law Reports Part 372 on page 382, the Court of Appeal highlighted the necessity for the judiciary to maintain public trust, and I quote, "The judiciary must not only be independent, but it must be seen to be independent to inspire confidence in the administration of justice." End quote. Across the oceans in India, The Bangalore Principles of Judicial Conduct emphasize that a judiciary of undisputed integrity is the bedrock institution, essential for ensuring compliance with democracy and the rule of law. In moments such as this, therefore, lawyers, more than any other group, must stand as custodians of conscience and agents of accountable change. The Uwais-led Supreme Court between 2006 and 2007 discharged this responsibility by reversing the impeachment of Governors Joshua Dariye and Peter Obi, and severely restricting the powers of the President when a state of emergency is lawfully declared in any state of the Federation. All eyes are now on the Ketere-Okun Court on the action of the current President to remove elected executives and legislators due to the declaration of a state of emergency. Many informed Nigerians are also curious to know whether 2/3 of all the members of the National Assembly, as required by the Constitution, can be decided without a division and physical count, but through voice votes, as the Akpabio and Abbas-led chambers did with such arrogant disregard for common sense. When people think of economic reform, ladies and gentlemen, they often think of economists and technocrats. But lawyers are indispensable in making reform legally durable and socially legitimate. Let me give 3 examples. As Minister of the Federal Capital Territory in 2003 to 2007, I discovered that the FCT was not being administered as required under its enabling legislation. The FCT is not a federated unit. It is not a state either. Rather, it is a territory established by the Constitution under the Federal Capital Territory Act, which is quite explicit and crystal clear about how it is to be lawfully administered. The FCT's administrative and development needs are placed by that act in the hands of the Federal Capital Development Authority. But before my tenure, over the years, the bureaucrats of the federal government have set up a ministry of the Federal Capital Territory to mirror the functions of the FCDA, supervise it as a parastatal, and often override it. We took a comprehensive review of the FCT Act undertaken by lawyers and an executive order comprehensively drafted by lawyers like Epo and Jimilawa and signed by President Olusegun Obasanjo to sweep away the ministry overnight, create the Federal Capital Territory Administration, FCTA, and restore the FCDA to its rightful position. The executive order also created 5 slim, functional secretariats headed by secretaries appointed by the President as equivalent of state commissioners. It was only after receiving a proper legal warrant from Mr. President under the FCT Act that my team and I were able to undertake the decent work we were able to do in the FCT back then. However, the powerful role that the law can play in shaping political and administrative reforms is exemplified in the way in which the FCT Act was deployed to create an appropriate structure to soundly manage the FCT and its agencies. We must insist on fidelity to the Act and the subsisting executive order of 2004 to ensure that it is not turned into an inefficient and sprawling bureaucracy. Before my stint as Minister of the FCT, I've had the privilege of being the Director General of the Bureau of Public Enterprises. The BPE back then was the engine room of some of the major economic reforms implemented by the administration of President Olusegun Obasanjo. But 3 are worthy of mention: the reform of the telecommunications, pensions, and electricity sectors of the economy. 2 of these, that is telecoms and pensions, were duly implemented between 1999 and 2003 while I was there with outstanding success. The jury is still out on the 3rd in the electricity supply industry, but I can say that none of them would have been attempted without the instrumentality of a raft of carefully considered new policies and laws prepared by a multidisciplinary teams of social scientists, finance experts, and of course, lawyers. Implementation too would have been impossible without them. I recall with satisfaction the roles played by Abdulkarim Adeshokan, a thoughtful economist and administrator who initially led the power sector team, Epo, a lawyer we brought in from the private sector, and the then Honorable Idris Umar, who later became a senator and minister, who was the chair of the House of Representatives Committee on Electric Power. These brilliant public servants worked very closely with Cameron McKenna, a law firm in the US, Anderson, and several Nigerian law firms to draft what became the Electric Power Sector Reform Act. Staying a little longer on electricity, the one sector in which we as a country are still very much challenged, we may observe that the latest reforms in the sector under the Electricity Act 2023 were preceded by the amendment of the paragraph 14B part 2, second schedule to the 1999 Constitution, via the astute removal of a single word from that paragraph, which gave it the more expansive and federalist-oriented interpretation it now has. Once it was clear that the Constitution would be amended in 2022, United Gentlemen of the Bar, the fifth alteration to the 1999 Constitution and the Electricity Act read together present a case study of how a comprehensive understanding of constitutional law and adroit skills of legal drafting and statutory interpretation are vital when undertaking any kind of political and economic reforms, since there can be no reform without the often complex legislative drafting. These achievements would not have been attained with the incisive application of political will, political will and commitment to the Constitution. Believe it or not, the 2019 to 2023 class of governors, which I was one, I'm proud to say I was one of them, worked very hard on this. 36 state governors coordinated to give approval to the constitutional amendment, and some of the governors lobbied very hard to pass the Electricity Act 2023 in April 2023, leaving enough time for President Tinubu to sign it before the expiration of the next assembly. But all this speaks to a powerful truth. The lasting and effective reforms of any kind are utterly impossible without the application of firm, incisive, sustained, and above all, selfless political will and leadership. This is what has been lacking with many of our failed or poorly performing reforms in Nigeria. Nevertheless, we need more reforms in Nigeria. Lawyers must also use their advocacy skills to push for reforms in public procurement, land titling, and tax administration. Nigeria's complex legal architecture can be a tool for investment or a trap for frustration. It depends on how it is navigated and who is guiding the ship. Our courts too must evolve. Commercial judges must be trained to understand emerging trends, areas like fintech, blockchain, climate change, energy transition, and digital trade. Alternative dispute resolution must be given teeth, not just as an afterthought, but as a credible avenue for obtaining a fair and timely resolution of disputes. Resolving the backlog of cases in the dockets of our judges requires that the bench and bar should design a framework for clearing them and enabling our legal system to offer an assurance of adjudication within the shorter time frame. They say justice delayed is justice denied. Law reform commissions must be revitalized and populated across the country with practical minds, not just merely theorists. As agents of economic reform, lawyers must think systemically and act institutionally. The judiciary has historically served as the stabilizing or moderating institution against extremist tendencies, even in military administrations. We recall the Supreme Court's decision in Lacomi against the Attorney General of the Federation, in which the doctrine of covering the field was established, whereby when both federal and state laws exist on the same subject, the federal law prevails, rendering the state law void to the extent of its inconsistency. The Supreme Court, in this case, also determined that Decree number 45 of 1966 or 68, which contained an ouster clause, was unconstitutional, as it amounted to a usurpation of judicial power, thus violating the principle of separation of powers and the rule of law. The court was emphatic that even under a military regime, laws could not be enacted to override the Constitution without necessity. This decision reaffirmed the supremacy of the Constitution and the judiciary's role in upholding the rule of law, even during periods of military rule. It established that even military governments are bound by constitutional principles and cannot arbitrarily enact laws that infringe upon individual rights without just cause. Looking back to our constitutional history, it is remarkable but true to say that the golden years of the Supreme Court of Nigeria, what became known as its years of judicial activism, occurred during the military rule and were driven by names like Chief Justice Adetukubu Ademola, who presided over the Lakami case, Justice Chukwuneke Idigbe, who, while not overtly controversial, expressed judicial opinions that reflected deep concern for constitutional order and legal certainty, even in the uncertain environment of military dictatorship. We also had Mr. Justice Kayode Esho, regarded as the greatest of the judicial activists, who was revered for his insistence on judicial independence and fundamental rights, who was reputed to have made the famous statement about judicial courage to wit that, and I quote, "The court must not be seen to be an errand boy of the executive." May the soul of Justice Kayode Esho rest in peace. Last but most certainly not the least is Justice Chukwudifu Akune Okuta, the philosophical moral voice of the Supreme Court, whose jurisprudence reflected a deep understanding of human rights, implications of laws, and the sanctity of the judicial branch. Listen to him, and I quote, "If the legislature is corrupt, you go to the judiciary for redress. If the executive is corrupt, you go to the judiciary for remedy. If the judiciary itself is corrupt, where do we go from there?" May Almighty God bless Justice Okuta, and may his soul rest in peace. I was very proud to name a major street in Abuja after Justice Okuta. Is one whose judgments I enjoyed doing as a law student. Today, after 26 unbroken years of civilian governance, very sad to say, it is quite hard to mention names of jurists who we can all agree remind us of those golden days that God recently passed. Faith in the impartiality of our courts is being steadily undermined, not by the Constitution or by law, but by the conduct of those conferred with the high privilege of sitting on the bench. If we must be honest, we must admit that the perception of a high level of judicial corruption is now mainstream. This is not held by the opacity of judicial appointments, inconsistent rulings on electoral matters, the inexplicable delays in critical judgments, and the slap on the wrists meted to notoriously bad or lazy judges by the National Judicial Council, which I would respectfully say has not succeeded in its mission and is now itself desperately in need of reform and restructuring. As governor, I mobilized my colleagues to amend the Constitution to create state judicial councils so that we take the NJC out of appointing high court judges in the state and restrict them to federal judges and appellate judges. But we are not able to push the amendment through, but we'll continue to work until we achieve it, because I do not see any logic in having a unitary judiciary in a federal system. But that we can debate some other day. I'm no longer governor, but we'll see how this goes. Once upon a time, ordinary citizens tiptoed past the homes of judges. We were so scared of judges. I remember when we were sent to Justice Bello's home to deliver a message, we make sure that he's not at home before we go, because everyone was so scared of the kind, nice, and decent Justice Muhammad Bello. May his soul rest in peace as well. But not any longer. Now judges are abused and maligned with almost reckless abandon and with no consequences. They are physically and mentally assaulted, sometimes roundly disrespected by the ordinary citizen. How indeed are the mighty follow. But we must also resist simplistic narratives. Practically all judicial officers work under immense pressure while being poorly resourced and poorly protected. The problem is not merely one of bad actors, it is also one of weak institutions, and dare I say it here, a lack of courageous leadership within the bar. If the judiciary is to regain its moral authority, lawyers must lead the way there. We must speak out, not only when the bench errs, but also when the bar fails. After all, every member of the bench was once a member of the bar. But it was gratifying to hear the president of the NBA speak to some of these issues. We must support judicial independence while demanding judicial accountability. We must advocate for reforms, the National Judicial Council, to the funding mechanisms of the judiciary. We must insist and ensure that the criteria for appointment to the bench and elevation to the appellate courts must be raised and made devoid of even the slightest hint of opacity. There must be total transparency. Also, the discipline of erring judicial officers must be not only transparent,